That passage where everything is destroyed, there's no way really of hurrying that along. But the point of that passage is that recognizing something that no longer works or something that we've outgrown. And there's an epiphany, there's a turning point. So for me, the earlier story, I told you about deciding that I was going to be financially independent. That was a turning point. And from there, I began to look forward rather than back. And I began to make new goals, and I began to experiment, and I began to try new things. And I had no idea where it was going. I just knew that I needed to move forward. And something in that moving forward, we find new opportunities. There are synchronous events. Joseph Campbell is famous for the quote, "Follow your bliss, and the universe will open doors where once there were only walls." And it is that experience.
Welcome to the Onward Podcast. This is Emily Harmon, your host. Happy New Year. 2020 is behind us. I'm sure hoping for a much better 2021, and I know you are too. My guest today is Paddy Bear. Paddy grew up among the Plain people, the Amish and the Mennonites of Pennsylvania, and she was expected to follow in her ancestors' footsteps and become a Reformed Mennonite. Instead, her world was upended at a young age by an excommunication and a shunning that made national news. This trauma catapulted Paddy out of an insular world where women were commanded to obey their husbands, where television, wearing jewelry, voting, or serving in the military were all forbidden. Listen and learn how Paddy ended up graduating from the Air Force Academy, and after that, she became an airline pilot for United Airlines. In this episode, we talk about the hero's journey. We talk about Paddy's transformational journey and how we all have one. When you listen to this episode, you will learn tips around hearing the call of your wild soul and your personal spirit guides. You'll learn what to expect on your transformational journey. Paddy and I both talk about tests we've learned along our journeys and how we started paying attention to our inner wisdom and our intuition. And we both talk in this episode about how coaches have helped us on our journey as well. We all have a story, and we all play different roles in our lives. When we accept responsibility, that's a key part of transformation, because then we reclaim our sense of power. Get ready to listen, because I know you're going to enjoy this episode. Paddy, welcome to the Onward Podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You were class of 1986 from the Air Force Academy. So you were in the 7th class of women to graduate. I was in the 6th class of women to graduate from the Naval Academy. So we were going through those times of our lives right around the same time.
Yes. Yeah, very true. These were pioneering times. You're kind of on the leading edge, not the first class or the second, but there for all of those early changes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were just talking before we started this interview. I said how my brother was at the Air Force Academy the same time you were, and how he had kind of a life-changing moment and decided to leave. And you said something that I really resonated with that. You said, I think it was harder to leave than it was to stay, because there were so many times I thought about leaving, but that would have been really hard to do because everyone has all this faith in you and you're there and you're going to be labeled a quitter or whatever. And you might think that.
Yeah, when I got there, it was so different than what I expected. And I hadn't really known what to expect. I didn't come from a military background. And it was actually a radically different background than I was used to. And I had worked so hard to get in, like all of us had, and was kind of obsessive about talking about it. So then when I got out there and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I want to stay. And my brother, who we learned to play tennis together on the roads. And so, we play all the time. And he said, if you leave after I had to listen to you for the last year and a half, he said, I'm going to kick your butt and never play tennis with you again. Like, okay, I guess I have to stay.
Yeah. You mentioned your background. Tell us about your background and how did you end up at the Air Force Academy?
Yeah. So a big question, because it covers such a big arc in my life. I grew up among the Plain people of Pennsylvania, and that's the Amish and the Mennonites. And I grew up among this Orthodox sect of the Mennonites. And my mother wore long, dark dresses, and she wore a black bonnet. And we could only marry within the church. We only had friends within the church. All of our relatives were in the church. And my ancestors had been on this path for hundreds of years on both sides of my family. So I fully expected to grow up like my mother did and have her life. And we didn't vote. We weren't in the military. The men in our culture, if they were drafted, they declared as conscientious objectors. So totally different than going to the academy. But what catapulted me out of this background was what I think of now as a call to adventure. And it was a crisis. It was my father got excommunicated and he was shunned and he went berserk. And as part of that, he turned on his family. He turned on his family because he thought we should be loyal to him no matter how he behaved. And then he took his story to the press. He hired a publicist, he sued the church, and he got in the national news. He made the front page of the New York Times. He was in the New York Times several times. He was in the Washington Post. He was in People magazine. He was on Good Morning America. He even made Canadian newspapers and Canadian television. So on the outside, there is this, he was regarded as a folk hero. And meanwhile, we were living on the run from him. We were living this private nightmare. And there's this huge disparity between what the public believes and what we're actually living.
What was it that he did that made the front of all these papers and what was so popular in the news?
Well, it was an exotic story. So here is this little known kind of unusual sect that wears these plain clothes. And his story to the public was that they were shunning him. So shunning in our culture, they practice, if you were excommunicated, which happened if you either left the church or you were kicked out, then you were shunned. And they believed that shunning was an organized form of ostracism. So anybody who was still in the church, they couldn't eat with you, they couldn't do business with you, and they couldn't give you the traditional greeting. So you were shunned, you were on the outside. And as you can imagine, this is a huge deal when everybody when you live in an insular society and everybody belongs to this church, you're on the outside. But that part of the story was fascinating to the public. But which made it even bigger is that my father told people that his wife and his children were shunning him. So he got an enormous amount of sympathy, these 6 children. But we weren't members of the church, so we weren't required to shun him. And so that wasn't actually true. So promoted this story that was not true. And the national media ran with it.
Wow.
And yeah. So
how old were you at the time?
So I was 8 years old.
Wow. So what happened after that? I mean, I just don't understand how you got from there to the Air Force Academy.
Well, in the beginning, any type of transformational path, you go through a stage of undoing where something you've outgrown or something that no longer works, it may have worked before, but it no longer works. And you go through a path of undoing, just like the caterpillar goes into the pupa stage and everything becomes soup. And it's probably not terrifying for the caterpillar, but for we humans, this is a really terrifying stage, right? Everything that's familiar to us, everything that is comfortable is disintegrating. And we don't yet have a new life. We don't know where we're going or what we're becoming. So, but it's a necessary stage and sometimes a painful one. And so my whole life disintegrated. We fled our farm. We lived in hiding for many years and we had no money. And meanwhile, the glare of publicity is going on. It was such an interesting story to the public that it lasted for almost 10 years, which, if you think about national news, that's just an enormously long story.
Yeah. So that's when you were 18, when you were going to the academy.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't stop then. It made local news for almost 50 years. But so as out of this disintegration of this very traditional life, I start questioning things because that's what happens in chaos, right? You start looking at things new. You start asking questions, and you just start seeing the world differently. And so, I tell the story in the book that one day after we had fled our farm and we were at a new place, my mother's working 2 jobs. My 2 older brothers, myself and one sister, we have jobs as well. So I'm in 5th grade at this time, and I'm punching a time clock, literally punching a time clock kind of job, not delivering newspapers or, a kid's job, but an adult job, because we needed the money. We needed to make ends meet. And so I'm looking, and my mother's she's working 2 jobs, and she's making these little breads to sell at the farmer's market. And I am looking at these little breads, and I cannot for the life of me figure out how we're going to survive on this. Like, how are these little breads, how are they going to provide for us? And I decide that I'm never, ever, ever going to be in her position. I'm never going to be left with 6 kids and no means of support. And I'm going to rely on myself. And I don't have any idea how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to be financially independent. And so out of a decision like that, out of everything getting upended, a new goal was set in place. And like any new goal, we don't really know how we're going to do it when we begin. And I didn't. And what I ended up, I just kind of followed this trail of breadcrumbs, the things that seemed like they were moving me forward. I followed those. In 8th grade, I entered this race at track and field day that was a new event. And I won it, not because I was so fast, which I learned afterwards, but because the course was so hard that none of the other girls finished. And I ended up beating all but 3 of the boys. But I got recruited for the cross country team. And that was something that was unfamiliar in our environment. We didn't play varsity sports. We didn't really do any kind of activities or clubs that involved other people. In fact, we didn't have friends outside that group in the beginning. We played with our cousins. So it was just this very narrow world. But this brought me into a new environment and started new possibilities. And then I had other things that were on this trail of breadcrumbs. I had decided that if I was going to support myself, I should make really good money, and that meant going to college. And that too was completely at odds with our culture, because the idea was that if you got out there in the worldly world, you would be corrupted. You would be led away from the truth. And so education was discouraged. And my father he was very against it. He didn't want any of his children going to college. So I tell my brother about my plan, that I want to go to college. And he tells me to take all the hardest classes you can. Take 4 years of math, take 4 years of science, take 3 years of language. And so I don't know any better. I wouldn't have taken those classes if he hadn't said it, but I signed up for them. And then in 10th grade, he started taking flying lessons. And he was one of these people that thought that if he was taking flying lessons, that somebody else should be doing it too. So he talked me into taking flying lessons. And I wasn't really interested in flying lessons. I didn't have the money for it for more than one lesson a month. And I got airsick. And I was like, I don't really want to do this. But he paid for my first lesson, and he paid for my logbook. And I kept doing them, because one of the reasons was that we were in the national news, and we were very infamous. People would write us letters and tell us what terrible people we were because they believed my father's story. And so flying was kind of unique. It was different. And I thought if I was going to be known, that I wanted to be known for something good. And so I kept taking the lessons. And I was running cross country. I was getting varsity letters, which I didn't even know what they were whenever I started. But I had decided that I needed to get a running scholarship to pay for college. And I remember when I told my coach this, he didn't say anything for a long time. And I realized I was like, oh, he doesn't think I'm talented enough to get a running scholarship. But I didn't have any other options. So I was like, well, what does he know? So I just kept training, and then I ran marathons and joined the track team. But by the time I was a junior, I'm beginning to realize that I don't really have the talent that it takes to get an athletic scholarship for running. And so I don't have any money because I've spent my money on flying lessons. And I'm at this point where I'm like, okay, I really should have listened to my mother when she said, you should save your money rather than taking flying lessons. And I'm just in deep despair. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I'm standing at my locker the day before Thanksgiving break. And there was this message, an announcement over the loudspeaker that said, there's a cadet from the Air Force Academy in the guidance counselor's office. And I don't even know what the Air Force Academy is. I just think to myself, well, it sounds like maybe it has something to do with flying, because we didn't come from that background. And so I didn't have anything else to do. For once, I had the study hall coming up in the next period, and I didn't have any term papers to write. I didn't have anything to study for. And I was like, oh, well, I'll just go listen. And I walk in, and that changed my life.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you were going to school, you said that your mom dressed. Were you Mennonites?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So your mom dressed that way. Did you dress that way in the dresses with the?
Yeah. So we didn't dress that way until we officially joined the church, which was typically your late teens, early 20s.
Okay.
So we did not. We dressed in conservative clothing. We dressed in greens and blues and browns and things like that.
So and you went to public school?
We did.
Mm-hmm. So what did your mom say when you said, I'm looking at going to the Air Force Academy, the military? That's not in line with your culture or anything, or even going to college.
Yeah, she was not very happy about the military aspect. She said, we weren't raised that way. And, the aspect of killing people, because we were part of a big part of the culture was that you were always supposed to turn the other cheek. Mm-hmm. And so that played a part in the publicity coverage. My mother never said anything, never refuted the story, because we were always supposed to turn the other cheek. And so the same thing with the military, it was not turning the other cheek, obviously. And then the other thing she worried about was the commitment, the active duty commitment. She was worried that I wouldn't be able to get married and have children. And so, yeah.
It's, I need to talk to my mom about this, because the other day she was over and at my condo, and there was this pamphlet from the Naval Academy when it was all about my plebe class, this pamphlet, and she picked it up and she's like, I didn't know you had this. And she was looking through it. And I said, well, you can take it home and look through it. She goes, no. She goes, I think that it was more stressful on the parents than it was on you. And I haven't had this conversation with her to really look at it from her point of view.
Oh, interesting. So she found it stressful.
Yeah.
You going into the military, or you just going away to college?
I think the military and the Naval Academy and how tough it was. And my plebe year, I had a knee surgery. I can't imagine, And then I would always call home and tell her I failed a class. So we just had these phone banks, right? We didn't have cell phones or anything. I'd call her home in tears, how miserable I was. I was in a cast from my toe to my hip, and I failed this class. And then I might call like 2 weeks later. So she's left wondering, right? And she's like, well, how about that test? Oh yeah, I got a C or B on it. So
it all worked out.
Yeah, I know now how much she was probably stressing over that and couldn't even reach me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I remember we got one phone call in basic. We got that one phone call a week, and it was for 5 minutes. And it was so short. I was like, I don't even know what to say. Like, what do you say in 5 minutes?
Yeah. So you went there, and then, I love what you wrote here. You said you've spent decades dedicated to the study of defying gravity, escaping conditioning, walking the transformational journey, and the practice of following the call of the wild soul. So you ended up becoming a pilot after you graduated from the Air Force Academy. So your brother paying for your first flying lesson and getting your logbook made a big difference in your life.
It made an enormous difference.
So what did you fly?
I flew KC-135s, which are the air refueling 4-engine. It's a 707, 717 is a civilian version, but we had an air refueling mission.
So for people who don't know, you're in the air flying your plane and refueling like a fighter jet.
Yeah, all kinds of different airplanes. We refueled fighter jets. We refueled transport aircraft, C-5s, C-141s.
While you're in the air flying.
While you're in the air, yeah. Yeah, so they come up behind.
Works. Yeah, how's that work? Yeah.
Yeah, so we would go up and we would fly a track. We would go up and we would do a rendezvous in the air, and then they would come up behind us, and we had a boom operator in the back. He would lay down on his belly, and he would extend the boom and kind of fly it into the port, their air refueling port.
In the other plane. That's got to be hard to get that to line up just right and everything. But at the time, there was only a few different kinds of planes that you could fly, right? Back in the 80s.
That's exactly right. So we couldn't fly any combat aircraft like fighter jets. We couldn't fly the C-130 gunships. But ironically, I was an aircraft commander in the first Gulf War, and we did fly in the combat zone. So we couldn't fly the combat aircrafts, but we were certainly in harm's way then. And of course, now it's a non-issue. I just watched 2 weeks ago, I guess, I watched the air show in Fort Lauderdale, and the F-35 demonstration pilot was a woman, and it was just cool,
Yeah, but you paved the way for that.
Yeah, we all did,
Yeah, because, there was a lot of question about what we could do and would be good pilots and all of that. So you had to prove that, yes, women can fly in order for it to get to the point where women could fly fighter jets.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So then you got out and you left the Air Force and you became an airline pilot.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Flying for what airline did you fly for?
So I flew for United.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I started out, I was a flight engineer, got hired in a flight engineer position on the DC-10. And then I flew the Boeing 737, and then the 757 and the 767. And then I retired as a captain on the 777.
So do you ever fly now? Do you miss it if you don't?
I do miss it. I do miss it partly because I just took an early retirement, and it came up suddenly because of this COVID. And so there's none of the usual retirement flight and all of the closure rituals basically that go with it. And so one day you're flying, the next day you're not. And, it's a whole shift in identity. And I miss the physical act of flying too. I don't miss the flying all night, the 12-hour flights. I don't miss the jet lag and, some of the other things, but I do miss the physical part of flying.
I guess you could still go out, especially once COVID's over, you could go, once you get all your sales from your book, you can go buy your own plane. You can fly. Tell us about your book.
So the book is called From Plane to Plane, My Mennonite Childhood, A National Scandal, and an Unconventional Soar to Freedom. And I wrote it for two reasons. I wrote one as an accountability project to set the record straight about what had actually happened. Because there's this whole gaslighting aspect to it. But the second reason for writing it, one that's probably dearest to my heart, is this idea of how you can follow the path of breadcrumbs out of some of these situations that feel untenable. And it's a transformational path. And so sometimes we have these things happen in our lives that seem like they're just an utter disaster, and your life is destroyed, and it's a very helpless feeling. It's a very powerless feeling. But out of that, there's so many possibilities.
Well, so there could be people listening now that, may not have followed the same path as you, but they feel like, especially with COVID and everything, my life's a mess. It's all upended. There's no hope. There's no way out. And you're saying there is. And sometimes you can't see it when you're in the middle of it, but you need to have faith.
Yes, exactly. something comes out of that, that passage where everything is destroyed. There's no way really of hurrying that along. But the point of that passage is that recognizing something that no longer works or something that we've outgrown. And there's an epiphany, there's a turning point. So for me, in the earlier story, I told you about deciding that I was going to be financially independent. That was a turning point. And from there, I began to look forward rather than back. And I began to make new goals, and I began to experiment, and I began to try new things. And I had no idea where it was going. I just knew that I needed to move forward. And something in that moving forward, we find new opportunities. There are synchronous events. Joseph Campbell is famous for the quote, "Follow your bliss and the universe will open doors where once there were only walls." And it is that experience of walking forward and trusting that those doors will open. I told you the story about there I was when the announcement was made for the Air Force Academy. And the truth is that if I hadn't had those flying lessons, I would never have even registered that announcement.
No, you wouldn't have.
Wouldn't have. And I wouldn't have been, if I hadn't listened to my brother, I would not have been prepared for the academy.
But you can only see, the only way to see that is to look back?
Yes. So the only way to see that is to look back, but also but also to trust that is the way forward as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like, I think that what you're saying too is what my dad always told me is take advantage of your opportunities. And you were presented with an opportunity to learn how to fly, and you took it. You could have turned it down, but you took it. You were presented with an opportunity to go hear an Air Force cadet talk. You didn't have to, that doesn't mean you had to go to the Air Force Academy, but you're trying to learn new things. So you took that opportunity. And then you see where it leads you. You can't just sit back in all of the chaos and say, something's got to happen. You have to start taking those little steps. In fact, Sky Nelson Isaacs, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, talks about synchronicities, and he views it as kind of this tree, and there's all these different branches. And you chose to put an apple, the branch, when you decided to, how you wanted to live in terms financially. You put another apple on the branch when you decided to take those flying lessons, another apple when you decided to go to hear the Air Force Academy guy. And then that makes the tree, those branches heavier. And that's kind of, you're making your path. I'm probably not explaining it exactly as Sky does, but by taking those little steps, you're creating opportunities for even more things to happen in your life.
Yeah, that's a really interesting visual image. I hadn't thought of it that way before. James Hillman describes it as the Acorn Theory. And he says that within the acorn, beneath the cap of the acorn, lie all the instructions for it to become a mighty oak tree. And that the same is true of human beings. And so that within each one of us, there are these callings that pertain to our unique path.
Yeah.
And that when we follow those, we step into our destiny. And so for me, that was always an understanding. Those breadcrumbs are something that we recognize. Not every opportunity that comes across our path is right for us. But if we pay attention to our inner guidance, and if we pay attention to where it is that we want to go and what feels right, that there is this path of breadcrumbs.
Well, what about, your inner critic says, you're not, look at your background. There's no way you could take flying lessons. How do you determine when and when not to listen to that inner critic? Because everyone has one.
Yes. That's a great question. How to listen to the inner critic? Well, what I would say is this, is that when it's inner critic, when it's damaging, and when you shouldn't listen, is the inner critic is mean, it's nasty.
Mm-hmm.
And do you ever listen to mean, nasty people? Should you ever give your power away to them? No. We often do, but they're the least reliable voice. And so there's also another inner voice that asks us to use our logic and asks us to do a risk analysis and asks us to be realistic. one of the things about the follow your bliss mindset is that I think it sometimes gets misunderstood, and people think, oh, that means I should only do the things that I want to do, that I like to do, that feel good. But this other voice is a voice of realism as well. And it says, okay, I know you don't like to do that, but is it relevant to where you want to go? And just because you don't know how to do it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, doesn't mean you shouldn't practice, doesn't mean you shouldn't develop the skill. So I guess what I would say overall to your question is that the inner critic, if it's mean, if it's nasty, if it puts you down, it's not a valid voice.
It's true. I think it's your reptilian brain just trying to keep you safe. I'll share an example of a time when I was presented an opportunity that I took that was life-changing, that I was scared to death to take. And that was, I was working in contracts for the Navy, and my boss asked me to move to the small business office, being in charge of helping small businesses find opportunities in the field of naval aviation. And I was terrified of that job. It wasn't even on my top 1,000 list. I'm an introvert. It required public speaking. It required putting on conferences. I didn't know how to do any of that. I did not want the job, but I took it, and it's helped me get to where I am now. I mean, hosting a podcast, doing public speaking, leading retreats. Yeah. It helped me figure out how to get out of my comfort zone. It got me a promotion to the next job. So that's a time when, I could have listened to my inner critic that said, Emily, who are you to go to this job that requires all that you don't even know how to do? And the other thing is, I think a lot of times women wait and only apply for a job when they know that they can do every single task in it. And and most men don't. So just take it and you can learn. No one is ever prepared 100% for the next job.
Never, ever. Never. That's so true. But so hard to remember in the moment too.
I know. That's why it's important to have a coach. So one of the things we were talking about is like, what's the difference between a coach and a counselor? And I know this is a whole bunch of questions at once, but is it important to have a coach along this transformational journey, or do you recommend doing it by yourself?
So I did not have a counselor, so I can't speak to that particular experience. And I didn't have a counselor because in aviation, when I was always very concerned about losing my FAA medical, which you need to fly. But I ended up with a coach that was life-changing for me. And I did have a severe inner critic. I had a severe inner critic that was paralyzing. And so for a long time, I thought that, it was somebody else's problem. Somebody else needed to change. And, a lot of it came out of the hostile environment that we faced as women in the military and in aviation, part of being pioneers. But eventually I was like, okay, so I'm the one that has to deal with the effects of this. So it's my problem. So I have to do something about it. And I hired a coach. And so here's what I would say to your question is, I hired a coach who was kind of a combination of both of those things, kind of a combination of a counselor and also a coach. And what I mean by that is that she was exceptionally kind, which is what I needed. And she also helped me to find a way out of that dark place. She was lighthearted, she was humorous, and she was incredibly wise. And so I think you can have both. I think you can do a counselor and a coach. I think you can have a counselor / coach, which is what I think of as the path that I went.
When did you start working with a coach?
So I started working with a coach 15 years ago.
Okay.
And in the beginning, we had a different relationship in terms, it was very much coach and coachee. And then later on, it shifted as I was able to gain control of my issue. It became more of a collaborative effort. So we would brainstorm together. It just was a wonderful relationship. And it was literally life-changing for me. And I still coach with her. Do I need to? Do I have to? No. But it's a wonderful experience. And and it expands me in so many ways. And I quite honestly, she's just a genius. I don't know how. I sometimes, as a coach myself, I'm like, how does she do that? But I do think it's really helpful to have somebody that can help you pull apart those threads and then put things back together in a way that is life-giving and healing for you.
They see things from a different perspective. We have blindfolds on, things that we don't see, blind spots that we don't see. So yeah. And when I was in, I spent my whole career working for the military, and they don't really, I got an executive coach when I was in my last job, but that was to help me perform that job. It was a lot of it, they didn't really invest in my personal development, my personal understanding who I am. And I even went to retirement courses, and they're like, it's all about the financial aspect of retirement, or the, don't move somewhere where you don't have friends aspect, but nothing about how do you figure out who you are. And so I'm retiring, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go do something different. But it's like, I've never even dreamed. I've just been face down working. How do I know what I want to do? How did you decide that you were going to become a coach, and how have you figured out who you really are?
Yeah, that's a big question.
I like asking big questions.
I know. I love big questions. I have to take a moment to stop and think about it. I want to address something. Hold on to that question for a second. I may have you ask it me again, because you raised something that's really important in the coaching world that bugged me. And that is that so often coaching separates the personal from the professional, and they can't really be separated. I mean, you know this as you go into a business. Your personal, all the things that you bring with it, that inner critic, what you're good at, what the skills that you need to build, it's all part of it. And I would look for someone as a coach, somebody who is willing to hold both of those things together, because a lot of people aren't comfortable with the personal aspect of it. It's too messy. But life is messy. Building a business is messy. Becoming a coach, anything new that you want to do is a little bit messy. And so combining that personal and professional I think is so important in coaching.
I do too. I think we've just kept it separate for too long. And I think COVID is helping people realize that needs to be combined. And it's helping people realize that the importance of being authentic. You see a lot more, and people think authentic, there's a lot of definitions for authentic. I mean, one, it could be you're just showing up as you, maybe your hair's not combed, you had a hectic morning, you're not like putting on a front, or, your dog barks during the Zoom call. In the past, that would have been like, oh my gosh, but now it's just like an everyday thing. But to me, living an authentic life is everything's in balance and everything's aligned, and you don't live a separate personal life versus your work life, and you're living true to your values, and you're living, true to who you really are. You're not a different person at work than you are at home, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is so true.
Yes. Yeah, so to my other question, I think it was along the lines of like, how did you decide when you needed a coach? And tell us more about your transformational journey.
So I decided that I needed a coach when going to work. My stomach hurt so bad that I had physical effects from it, and I wanted to quit. So I had this great job. I had this job that tens of thousands of people would line up to be in my spot, and I wanted to quit as an airline pilot. And I wanted to quit. It was just that painful. The one thing that kept me from quitting is that I wanted money to create my gardens. So that was the other thing. I realized, I really had to do something about this. And that's what drove me to coaching. And, in terms of transformation, in terms of living more authentically, I found that I was living in this very left brain, very male world. And to fit in, I had to live that very left brain world. But I'm an equally a left brain person and a right brain person. And so there was this whole other reality that I hid. And I had this understanding of life, like we talked about, this mystical understanding of life, where you follow this path of breadcrumbs. And I had mystical experiences as a child that were critical at different turning points. And I never spoke about it because I was sure that people would think that I was delusional and that they wouldn't take me seriously. And yet I knew I've lived my entire life this way, having had the experience as a child, I have trusted these callings. I have trusted this path of transformation. And that's just how I live my life. But I would never speak about it. And so I have started speaking about it. And this book was an illustration of what that path looks like. It's arduousness, it's ordinariness, and it's magic.
Yeah. So tell us about, you talk about a hero's journey or a heroine's journey and that everyone has one. How do you figure out what your journey is? And then also, why did you want to write a book about it? Why is it important to tell your story?
So it's important to tell your story for a couple of different reasons. One is that path of authenticity that you're talking about is as you talk your story into being, you begin living more and more that way. Also, if you're a victim of gaslighting, as I was and my family was, it's important to break that spell because gaslighting is it's a weapons grade psychological manipulation and a spell. The hero's journey is something that is separate from that, something that I'm very passionate about because it is a basic trail guide. It's kind of a universal trail guide of transformation. So I'll start with something that we can all relate to, and that is the metamorphosis process for a caterpillar. So the caterpillar is crawling along the ground, and it has no idea of the colorful and just amazing destination that awaits it on the other side of transformation. It has to go through a stage of dissolution, of dissolving, and of everything that was familiar, everything that was comfortable, it goes away, and it's in this, basically this goo. It doesn't look like its old self, and it doesn't look like its new self yet. And for us, this is one of the most uncomfortable places to be. And when we talked earlier about the personal and professional, this is the personal part. This is the personal where when we're building something new, or we don't resemble our old self or our new self. And
but if you're going through that and you have to go to work every day, that's tough.
It is. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it was one of the reasons why I have always loved the hero's journey, which we'll get to in a moment, because I was like, I could chart my path. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is where you are, and in the hero's journey, we call this stage the underworld. Mm-hmm. And so if you can recognize, oh, this is where I am, this is the stage, you know what's required of that stage, you know what it looks like, and it's not so scary anymore. But so out of this pupa stage, then we begin the adult emerges, the adult butterfly emerges, but it's not fully emerged at this point. And it is becoming something new. And then it emerges as a full butterfly in all its color, and it has the ability to fly where it used to only be able to crawl. And so the hero's journey follows that same metamorphosis, that same transformational path, but it speaks to the human condition. And would you like me to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
The 4 stages?
Uh-huh.
So stage 1 is what they call, let me back up and just say where the hero's journey came from is the famous mythologist Joseph Campbell. So this isn't something I made up but what he discovered was that beneath all the great stories, all the enduring stories of all time, they had the same basic structure beneath them. And so the idea is that our human stories, we all have the same basic structure beneath our life stories. And we go through, if we're living, if we're growing, if we're evolving as human beings, we go through this metamorphosis many times in our life. And so I'm sure if you think back to this process, you've been through this many times in life, and starting a business is another one of those journeys. But stage 1, and for your viewers who are out, or your listeners who are out there just hearing this, I'm going to describe it in visual terms. If you think of it like a clock, 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock is the ordinary world. This is our comfort zone, right? This is our everyday life, what we're used to. Whether we like it or not, it's what we're comfortable with. And in that first stage, we get a call to adventure. And the call to adventure is always either an opportunity or it's a crisis. So as I talked about in my book, at 8 years old, that call to adventure came as a profound crisis. But for someone like you, wanting to start a business, it comes as an opportunity. Hey, it's a desire. Hey, I want to do this. And we move into the second stage once we're committed to change or change has called to us. We move into the second stage, which is generally described as the underworld. So here we meet a new world with new rules, with new allies, with new enemies, with new obstacles. If you think about boot camp in the military, that's an initiation. It's an initiation into the underworld, into a whole new experience. And in this stage is the undoing. Something in our life we've outgrown, or something in our life no longer works. It may have worked before, but we can't take it with us in this next stage. We can't take it with us in our transformation. And so we go through this process of dissolving our old self. And in that we meet our greatest fears, our greatest enemies. So when you talk about the critic, that may be what we're meeting. And for me, that was what drove me to coaching, is I was like, oh, okay, this is your problem. Like, you have to address this. Nobody else is, you can ask other people to change all day long, but so for me, and then there's a turning point in this stage. There's an epiphany and a recognition, and the old self has died. And now it's time to move to building a new self.
So before we get to building a new self, I want to say, I think that's really key. A lot of people have their stories about how their life is, and they blame other people. And a big change, a big realization is, oh, wait a second, I had something to do with that story too. And what was that part of my story, and what was my role in it? Like, I'll just give an example. I have this story about how my kid's dad was verbally abusive. All right. And he was. But it's easy to play the victim role. He was verbally abusive. I was a victim. That was my life. But I have to look back at, what was my role in that? Why did I let him be verbally abusive? I remember going to the counselor once and crying and telling the counselor all this stuff. And he's like, okay, well, when's our next appointment? I'm like, I don't need an appointment. He's the one that needs to change. Why is it me? He's like, well, you need to look at, why did you even put up with that for 7 years? Why didn't you leave? What is it about you? So what was my role in that I stayed in that? So I think it's a big key to when we realize that we are the only ones responsible for our lives, and you can't blaming it on other people. And losing that point where you blame it on other people, or stopping that, is a big key to transformation.
I completely agree. That is part of the experience of the underworld, is this sense of powerlessness and helplessness. And what comes out, what is the turning point? What is the phoenix point? Because that's at the 6 o'clock position, is in some way reclaiming our sense of power. Even though we don't know how we're going to do it, we make a decision. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that people often do in the underworld is they want to jump to having a new life. They want to jump to creating new things when they haven't yet made a decision that this old way doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so for me in the book, the Phoenix point was that decision of, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to be financially independent. And I didn't have anything, I wasn't responsible for my father's behavior. Mm-hmm. And I'm a kid in this situation, but it was a turning point. It was a profound turning point. And that's always what happens at the Phoenix point in the hero's journey.
Yeah. And like you said, that was one of your Phoenix points. You've had many different journeys, but yeah. So what's next after that happens?
So the next stage is stage 3, and that's from 6 o'clock position to the 9 o'clock position, and that's the road back. And when we talk about coaching, and we talked about the personal and the professional, this is the place that we most often think of as mentoring or coaching, where people help us strategize or they create a game plan. But on the road back, so we have this new decision, we're going to do something different, but we don't have any idea how that's going to happen. We at this point, we don't even have a clear goal. We don't even know enough to set a goal. We don't even know what we don't know. So we start this process of experimenting and trying new things. And just moving forward. It's basically taking a step forward, taking risks, doing something new, doing something different. But as the journey progresses from the 6 o'clock to the 9 o'clock position, what happens is that the more times we take risks, the more times we follow opportunities, we become clear about what it is that we want. And we become clearer about this sense of a clear goal. And as the goal gets clearer and clearer, there's some kind of organizing principle where, we talk about the synchronicities and we talk about the ways in which life conspires with us, as if there's a collaboration. Mm-hmm. The clearer we get, the faster we move. And so here's where we want to build skills. Here's where we want to develop strategies. Here's where we want to create plans. Here's where we want to hire a coach to go, hey, here's what I want to do as an objective outside person. I need someone to help me strategize. I need someone to help me build skills and build habits, because that's all going to be needed for this new level of life that you want to live at, this new person. Because literally what's happening is just like the caterpillar's becoming a butterfly, we're becoming someone new. And that becoming requires a new consciousness level. It requires new skills, new habits.
Because a lot of people, I guess you don't move from one phase to another in a matter of months or years. Some people stay in that underground phase for their whole life, right?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So the underground phase, if you get stuck there, and you get stuck in blame. You can get stuck in powerlessness and helplessness. And yes, they can stay there their entire life. And I know people who have, and you probably, can think of people who have either public examples or private examples. It is possible.
So to get out, it's a decision.
It is a decision, and it is a really simple decision. It is that in some way, you're focusing on what you don't want. And that's really important. Initially, that's really important point of clarity. So when you talked about, being in a relationship with verbally abusive, it's really important to go, I don't want that.
Right.
This does not serve me. And so I don't want to, but we don't want to get stuck there. We want to make that decision. Yeah, this isn't, and we want to get that clarity. And then we want to move to the clarity around what we do want. And so that Phoenix point, that is the tipping point, is we're moving from, I don't want this, to I want something different.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not like a split decision. Like I did it several times. I want to leave, I'm going to leave, but then I go right back. So
yes.
You've seen that in physically and verbally abusive relationships. You see that a lot, where people leave several times and it takes a while for them to finally leave, because you might say you don't want it, but then you think of all the things that you do love about that person, because I did love him, but mm-hmm. I don't love the way I feel and the way I'm being treated. And so you have to start to love yourself more than you have to love yourself enough to leave, I guess is what.
Yeah,
yeah. So, okay. So
that is exactly
next?
Right. And until you make that decision, you don't start doing something different. You don't start looking for a different kind of relationship.
Right.
You don't start setting boundaries and saying, no, you can't do that. And that's the critical point.
Yeah. So then you're I think we're at the 9 o'clock position.
So at the 9 o'clock position, yeah. So each of these positions, the 3 o'clock, the 6 o'clock, the 9 o'clock, and even the 12 o'clock, are turning points. Something shifts. And so the road back from 3 to 6, we've been doing all of this work. We're building a whole new life, and we're becoming something different. So now there's a testing stage that comes into play. And it's like a final exam. We're moving into the final exam stage. How much have you learned? Are you ready for this? Can you hold this new life? And there's also a change back message that comes here. So the people in your life, you are on the cusp of becoming somebody different. And for a lot of the people around you, if they have not made this journey before, or they don't know how to relate to you now that you're becoming this new person, you're going to get some pretty good change back messages. And the question then is, okay, are you serious about living this new life? And so that's one of the things that gets addressed here at the turning point, is there's a change of identity. And you are moving into living at this new identity on a permanent basis. And there is a final exam period. In some way, you will be tested. What have you learned? Are you up for this? Can you live at this level? And then the final part of this stage is that in some way, your entire journey of transformation serves other people. And even though you're not intending to do that. So it may be that you return to your community or you return to a new community with some knowledge, or you return with some wisdom or some healing aspect. In literature, they call this return with the elixir. So if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, we talk about what it was like to be in those early classes at the academy. There was something in each of our individual journeys that paved the way for other people. Someone saw that and was like, well, if she can do it, maybe I can do it too. And if they can survive, hey, it's possible. Or maybe one of the most common ways that we serve others on this journey is that we set an example.
Set an example. You become a shining light. You live your life and people see a difference in you. And also by sharing your story like you're doing now, people see, I can do that. They can see themselves in that story. They can maybe even be picturing where they are on that clock. Just a quick example of how I was tested, I think. This is with my father, and there was something, we were having a discussion, and I don't remember exactly all that it is, and it doesn't matter, but we were having a discussion, and I didn't react to the discussion the way I might have normally reacted.
Yeah.
And his response was, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, "Nothing." And I knew that I had made a big change in my life because I didn't go down that rabbit hole. It was a great feeling.
Yeah, it is a great feeling. Yeah.
That's just a little example. It's not a huge test, but you're going to have little tests. You're going to have big tests. And it's fun. It's fun to see that when you can see that change in yourself. Yeah.
It is fun. And it's, one of the reasons why I love the hero's journey is that when these things come up, when these tests come up, before I began to understand this journey, I thought, I had done something wrong. And now I look at it and I go, that's a test. So how are you going to meet it?
So what's an example of some tests you've had?
So, I'm trying to think. I mean, there's so many, and I just naturally think that way now. The one that comes to mind is a relationship. So I had in my 20s, I had a relationship that was an addictive relationship. I knew it wasn't good for me, but I could not break away from it. I knew I couldn't. I just had this, I was paralyzed. And eventually I did break away from it. I had this sudden epiphany just out of the blue. And I realized that this situation was never, ever going to change. I kept thinking, it'll be different when, that sort of thing. And, I had this moment and I was like, it's never going to change. So you have to get out of it. So I did get out of it. And then years later, I would run into this person at work and the same patterns would be at play. He would talk to me. We would be in a conversation and then he would leave to go talk to somebody else and expect that I would stand there. And for years I did. And then I was like, why are you standing here? Like, this is rude. And B, you're just going to keep. So I just left. And he was like, wait. And I was like, it's no problem. No problem. I mean, I didn't hold anything against him. I'm like, if you want to go talk to somebody else, if they're more interesting, hey, have at it. It's nothing personal, but I'm not going to be here waiting. And it, like you said, it feels wonderful because you take your power back and you're like, it's nothing personal to the other person. I didn't dislike him. I just wasn't going to do that anymore. Yeah. And so, that's an example of a test, but we get these tests all along our path. I was smiling. I was listening to your 100th episode of your podcast, and you talked about how you had made this decision to start something new in your life. I don't know if you decided to do the Onward podcast, but clearly you were moving in a new direction, and it was like, it was your time. And then you talked about how the father of your children got a terminal illness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this, and I was like, I listened to it, I was like, oh, that's the test at the 3 o'clock position. That's the threshold guardian. And it's like, how badly do you want this? How serious are you about this? Are you prepared for this journey? And, we get these tests all along the way. And if we can see them as not, oh, I'm taking the wrong path, or, oh, I messed up, or I'm wrong here, but as, oh, what am I being tested? What is the actual test here?
Yeah, because what you're saying, I retired and I published the Onward podcast, and then 3 weeks later, he got that diagnosis. And I'm pretty proud of myself that I didn't let that diagnosis make me put my plans on hold. I still published an episode a week, even though he was sick and I was helping take care of him. And there was just, it was awful. But I did put my personal coaching stuff on hold a little bit. But then after he died, he gave me a gift, because I saw him on his deathbed. I saw him take his last breath, and I realized I'm going to be more intentional about how I live my life, because I'm not going to die with regrets. And I know he did. And then that's when I started, took the spring, and then I started the Onward movement, which is, like you said, you start to kind of give back, you start to share with others, which is what I feel like, which is something that I'm trying to do through that Onward movement. I did some work with a coach who helped me with an exercise that's supposed to help you figure out your dharma, your purpose in life and stuff. And 3 statements came out when we did that. It was like an hour-long session, and 3 things came out. And the 3 things that came out of what my purpose in life is were already on this Onward Movement manifesto. And It was, although we strive to improve ourselves, we know we're enough just the way we are, helping people see that they're enough the way they are. We create space for others. We hear you. You're not alone. We're connected, like making sure people feel heard. And there was one more, and they were already on this manifesto. So it's like, wow, it's just brought tears to my eyes, because it's like, I feel like I know I'm living out my life's purpose is to lead this Onward movement, and to interview people like you and to share their stories. That's my purpose. And everybody has a purpose for being here. What do you feel yours is, or do you know it?
I do know it. And my purpose is to teach this path of the practical mystic, is that within each one of us, we know, like you just said, you knew it was in you already.
Yeah.
And it is the courage to identify what's within you and to walk that path, because it's not easy to tell other people, hey, let's be vulnerable. In our culture, that is not an easy message, and particularly not from the background that we come from. Right.
Right.
But it is so essential, and you have to be vulnerable if you're going to live what is within you, and I come back again to that image of the Acorn Theory. We have the instructions, just like you did. We have the instructions for our dharma, for what both the path we want to walk, and that gift that is at the end of the hero's journey that we offer from our souls, basically. And, it's
brings
just
tears to my eyes. One of the ways I've found it, I talk about this, see if this is something that you do too, is meditating and being quiet, because my drug of choice is to stay busy and not to feel. And I felt like after working for the military for 38 years, I didn't know how to feel. I didn't even know how to write my hero's journey. I had to hire a coach to help me. I have 2 coaches, one that help me write that hero's journey, like figure out my story and put feeling into it, because my first website was all kind of written like a Navy instruction. Right. I had to put feeling in it. And I was so out of touch with my feelings. And then another counselor that just helped me with feelings, because I pushed them down and just stayed busy. That's what I had to do to survive in that male-dominated environment, and to survive being a single parent, and to survive that verbal abuse. I had to just not feel it. And so I've been spending a lot of quiet time. And that's, I think, people be like, well, how do I find out what's in my acorn? I think you have to be alone with yourself to do it. So is that something that you've been doing?
So I don't do meditation per se. I may do walking meditation. Like, I get enormous insights and creativity when I'm walking. But what I think it's important to do is, whether you meditate or however you do it, is to honor what comes from you, honor the insights, honor the epiphanies that you get, because the more that you do that, the more that you will become aware of aware of your inner guidance, aware of the outer guidance. It's like synchronicities. If you begin paying attention to them, you will notice more and more. If you begin paying attention to your intuition, you'll notice more. And you can be guided by your feelings. Your feelings are a form of intuition. The body has an enormous amount of wisdom for you, and you can use that as a compass alone.
So when you walk, do you listen to podcasts, or do you just have quiet time?
So sometimes I listen to podcasts, sometimes I listen to music, but oftentimes what happens is then I will just get ideas, or I will get insights and inspiration. And I also pay attention to dreams, because we have so much information that is available to us, so much mentoring. James Hillman talked about this as well, along with the Acorn Theory, the sense of the ancient Greeks and Romans talked about what they called a daemon. Some people call it a guardian angel, but it's a sense of this inner genius. And we have so much guidance at our fingertips, but we have to pay attention to it, and we have to honor it. And I don't mean obey it, because I don't obey my guidance. I always take it in, and I always subject it to a sanity test, and I do use logic and a risk analysis. I don't follow anything just blindly, but
right.
I have had just some remarkable experiences, and so I write it down. I write down dreams. I write down guidance.
So you do journaling.
I do journaling. Sometimes I just make note of it.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing about guidance too, is that, I had a dear friend say to me, guidance always comes in advance of need. And that was my experience. So I have had guidance that didn't become a player for years. And I had this experience I used to attend Quaker meeting, and they don't have ministers or anything. You just listen to what comes through you, and you can stand up and say what came through you. But so one day I was sitting there, and I heard this fully formed sentence, and it said, "Truth loves all people, heals all people, and is all people. But truth makes no compromise with fear, nor seeks to hide herself in sweetness, but rings out pure and clear and with the strength of clarity." And I sat there and I was like, okay, so am I supposed to pass this on? And I didn't really get that sense. I was like, I don't think so. I don't think I'm supposed to stand up and say this. So then I started looking around in my life. I'm like, well, what does this apply to? Does this apply to some relationship? And I couldn't find anything. But it was clear. The only thing that was clear is I was supposed to write it down. So I did. And I kept it for years. And then it became clear when I started writing, and particularly when I started writing about a subject, in this book, difficult subjects. It was guidance well ahead of time about how to tell the truth.
That's really cool. So what was the most difficult part of your transformational journey that you write about in your book?
The most difficult part is, and I think this is probably the most difficult part for anybody's journey, is what we talked about in the hero's journey, and that's the underworld. Mm-hmm. Because, and in particular, what that looked like for me was my father was telling this story in public, and we were living this private nightmare. And the most frustrating thing for me was this sense of helplessness and powerlessness. And I felt like, and this is common to the underworld stage, is I felt like it would last forever. Like, would we ever escape? Would we ever get out of this? Would life be any different? Because it lasted a long time by any standards, but it felt like it was going to last forever. And that was probably the most difficult part. Was
how'd you get through
escape? I think that, so as a child, I just survived. I couldn't do anything else. And I just endured for a long time. I do something different now. Part of it is recognizing it, and the underworld doesn't always have to be painful. I think we have a choice where we can go with it. We can look at it and say, what is change asking of me? And as a child, I didn't have the skills to do that. But today I can sort of step back and look at it more objectively and say, what is change asking of me? Because what the underworld is asking of us is to, in some way, to be able to see in the dark and to see what is the underlying issue that is up for review in your life now. And if you can do that, then it's not so scary. You're not in the dark anymore. You're like, oh, okay, this isn't fun, and it may last a little bit longer, but the whole point is to get clarity. So once you get clarity, you move out of that stage.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we wrap this up, tell us the name of your book, when it's coming out, and then tell us what's next for you.
So the name of the book is From Plane to Plane, My Mennonite Childhood, a National Scandal and an Unconventional Soar to Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's coming out February 23rd. And what is next for me is, I should say this, it's available for pre-order now. So
okay.
It's
I'll put the link in the show notes for pre-order.
Sounds good. And what is next? I want to write another book. I want to write Adventures of the Soul. And I wrote this book really as an illustration, as a real life illustration of what it looks like to follow the call of the wild soul. I wanted to inspire people that this is possible, it's practical, and to show them exactly what it looks like. And so then the next book will be about, practically speaking, how do you do this? How do you listen to, how do you hear guidance, all the different kinds of guidance, and how do you walk this path, practically speaking, for individuals in their life?
That's awesome. How do people find you? You have a website?
Yes. So you can find me at theflyingclub.com,
okay.
THEFLYING CLUB. And I also have an author page on Facebook, Paddy Bear author on Facebook, for anybody who'd like to connect with me around this book. Or this is my second book. So I wrote a first book around parenting, and it will be on there as well.
Okay. What's the name of your first book on parenting?
The first book is called House of the Sun, a visionary guide for parenting in a complex world.
When did that come out?
That came out 4 years ago.
Awesome.
I co-wrote that with an extraordinary teacher who was just amazing with children. And so I wrote it as a way of understanding what she did and how she did it. And I wanted to write a book for parents who, when you're in the most difficult times, and one of the things I found is it's as a parent is, in the times when you most need it, you're like, oh, what did that expert say? What am I supposed to be doing here? And I wanted something that drew on people's inner wisdom, because I think every parent has it, and nobody knows a child better than that parent. And so I wanted something that they could tap into right away. So that was the first book.
Oh, that's so true. I can think of so many tough times and I'm like, what should I do? What should I do? But like you said, we know that child, we know what's best. I mean, in fact, I dealt with that a lot with in the addiction world, because I helped form a group called Parents Affected by Addiction. And we were talking to different parents, and there's all these different theories, tough love or kick them out and all this stuff. But ultimately, the parent has to do what they feel is best for their child, and they know their child. And so the answer inside you, and you just have to be able to tap into that and figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted, was some quick way of accessing that in the moment. And so I broke that down into warmth and order, because those were the two basic ingredients that every child needs.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that look like? And if parents can tune into that, they're like, oh, okay, I know what that looks like for me. I know how to do that. So
that's awesome. Paddy, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It was a delightful conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this interview. Paddy and I are going to be live in the Onward Movement Facebook group on January 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us there and then get all your questions answered by Paddy. In order to find the Onward Movement Facebook group, just go to Facebook and in groups, search on Onward Movement and submit your join request. Or you can go to my website, emilyharman, HARMAN.com. Have a wonderful day and Happy New Year.